Hello, everyone. Welcome back to the Advancement Center and the reading of The Magic of Life by Robert Young. I left off on chapter 33 and now begin reading chapter 34. It was almost 10 in the morning when the phone rang again. They had finished their meal and had cleared up and were walking around the house as if they were in another world. They enjoyed having light conversation and were enjoying each other's company. The phone pulled them out of that space, and the noise of the storm immediately came in. It was such a shock to them all, and as Henry leaned down to pick up the phone, he put his hand up to the others and said, "Just settle down and hold the space. We don't want to lose this now just because of a phone call." As Henry answered, he heard the panicky voice on the other end of the phone. Mary and Willem felt the contrast of the panic to the calmness transmitted from Henry. They chose to go with the calmness and allowed themselves to settle into the quiet again. The panicked voice on the other end of the phone belonged to Elizabeth Willis. Elizabeth and her husband Michael were virtually the town council, and with Michael being the local judge, they virtually ran Norwich. Elizabeth and Michael were quite strong characters, but under these conditions, they knew that something more was needed than they were able to provide. Elizabeth knew the only person who could help her in this situation was Henry. Feeling great panic, Elizabeth said, "Henry, the center of town has almost washed away. We now have a gully that you could drive a truck through from the mountain right through to the beach. All our services has gone, and the sewage is broken. Beach Road has almost disappeared, and all of the services have been washed out to sea, and the foundations of Plaza 2 are actually showing. We can't service all of the people. Their houses have been washed away. What are we going to do, Henry?" Henry had never heard such panic in Elizabeth's voice. He knew Elizabeth very well, and he knew her as a woman of strength. She could almost hold the soil together, but on this occasion, everything had gotten away from her and everything was disappearing. She had no control and was in total panic. Henry knew there was nothing he could do, but he knew it was very important that the leaders maintain the stability for the rest of the town. Speaking very calmly, he answered her, "Elizabeth, pull yourself together. You can't panic while riding out a storm, or you'll drown, and so will everybody else. Where's Michael?" "I have no idea where Michael is. He's on the other side of the gully somewhere," she said. "You know our communications are still holding," he said. "No, I only rang you just in case. I knew that somehow you would make the communications work. When I got to the plaza, they directed me straight to where you are now. How did they do that?" "How they did that, I don't know," replied Elizabeth. "All communications are in order. Make a few calls to your friends and find Michael. Get yourself settled and then call me back," ordered Henry. "But Henry, what are we going to do?" asked Elizabeth. "Without Michael," said Henry, "you'll do nothing. Stay where you are and do nothing. You need to stop panicking. Are you at home, Elizabeth, or in the chambers?" "I've been in the chambers for 2 days, Henry. I haven't had a break," she said. "Have you had any sleep?" asked Henry. "I don't remember," answered Elizabeth. "Just sit there for a moment and focus on my voice. I want you to relax, and in your mind, I want you to go to another place. I want you to go back home, wherever that is," said Henry. "Henry, what are you going on about?" she asked. "Just listen, Elizabeth. Do as I say. Everything will be all right," said Henry reassuringly. Elizabeth quieted down, and Henry repeated, "I want you to relax, and I want you to go to a special place, a place you feel at home, a place where you can relax. It could be a beautiful scene, or it could be home where you belong, but most of all, make sure it's where you feel totally comfortable and relaxed." Henry could hear the sigh as Elizabeth found that place, and he knew she had found a beautiful, serene beach in the sun. He could feel her energy start to relax. Henry went along with his vision and continued, "Now see the trees and see the sun shining on the water. Hear the gentle roll of the waves and feel yourself melting into the scene." As Henry continued to talk, Mary's mouth fell open again. She had never heard such things from Henry. His voice was so calm and peaceful, and the things he was saying were so beautiful. Willem found himself fixed on Henry also. He recognized the beautiful feelings that came from listening to Henry's voice, and he knew that Elizabeth would be totally relaxed by now. Henry went on, and through guiding her, lifted Elizabeth from where she was in the chambers and put her in that special place where she was totally relaxed and comfortable. He lifted her spirit and told her to stay there and not to return until she had Michael at her side, and even if Michael was unable to get there, to make sure that he was at her side. Elizabeth's voice came back on the line. "Thank you so much, Henry. Michael's by my side. I can feel him. I'm okay now. I'll call you back in a couple of hours," she said. "Bye, Elizabeth," said Henry as he put down the phone. As he turned to Mary, his face was aglow. To Mary's surprise, he looked different again, though she could not pick what it was. She just knew that he had changed again. She could not believe the beauty in his face, and all she wanted to do was hug Henry close, but she knew that she could not touch him at that point because it might disturb his whole being. So they all sat and looked at one another and allowed themselves to drift off into the distance and allow the storm to continue on. Willem's focus was clear, but in the background he could feel the influence of Michael Willis. Michael had been a close friend for many years, but he had pulled away from Willem at a time when the law was created to stop people leaving the island. The law was made so that a whole family could not leave the island together. Once people were married, they could not travel together on holidays, and their passage on the ships would be canceled immediately by order of Michael Willis. Henry had never been involved in the preparation of this law. His father, Edward, was the one who knew the way to control people and the how to maintain his island. Edward knew that the way to keep his income was based on keeping people separated and by maintaining the people on the other side of the island. His aim was to keep the country people in fear of his holiday resort and his beautiful vision of Norwich. While ever the people of the island maintained the supplies and kept everything living and kept free of income. Then Edward Olsen could do as he pleased. He could build his paradise in such a way that he had income and ownership and control all at the one time. Heinrich Smithers, the character that Willem played many years ago, actually knew Michael Willis as a close friend. It was Michael's job to place restrictions on the people when the law was brought in, and he soon became tied to the money and to the apron strings of Edward Olsen. It was Michael who judged against Heinrich on the ownership of the land. Heinrich actually owned the entire Norwich area. He owned it by claim. He was the one to discover it, and it was he who actually made it possible to live in the area. The dock was located near the rocks at the edge of Norwich, but it was only possible to come in there under light seas. Nobody lived in the Norwich area because it was basically sand dunes and uninhabited, dry and barren country. Heinrich had seen this type of country before, and he could see the potential of the beach. It was a beach that has been untouched, and a beach that with a little bit of attention could turn into a paradise. Heinrich laid claim to that area and built the first buildings and cleared a major portion of the land. But when Edward Olsen decided that he wanted the entire area, he had Michael create new laws. He had the town council take over responsibility, and he started to control the people of the island. As a result, when Michael ruled against Heinrich as owner, Norwich became an open town in the hands of Edward Olson. It was a very smart move at the time, and in the long term, it proved to be a very successful move, but it started the demise of Heinrich Smithers. In conjunction with Sally, or Salamander Guthridge, Heinrich fought for many years to maintain order in the town. The influence of Edward Olson, although major, became at least controllable. Sally was smart enough to make sure she had enough control by gaining background information on Edward Olson, information that gave her sufficient power to get alongside him and act as his friend. She was then able to threaten him when she needed to maintain some form of order in the growth of such an initially degraded area into what it was today. When Heinrich disappeared and became Willem, once again it made little difference to the town, but it did relieve a lot of pressure. When Sally died, everything seemed to become normal again. This was the opposite of what Willem expected. Now here he was sitting with two dear friends, his daughter and his young student, feeling that he was as young as they were and having no grudge at all against Michael Willis. He even found himself feeling for Elizabeth Willis and feeling for the mammoth task that she had taken on at that time. Willem knew that he was changing, and he knew that something had happened. He was in the middle of a cyclone and everything was being stirred up, but he felt calm. The past seemed to be disappearing and rolling out the door to be washed away by the rains. The more he focused on Michael, the more the past seemed to disappear and more peace came into his life. He actually saw a picture of Michael standing in front of him. In his own way, he let his feelings go out to Michael, and there was forgiveness. Right at that point, the phone rang again. This time, Willem jumped up to get it. He knew it was Michael. He picked up the phone and said, "Willem speaking." Michael sounded surprised and said, "Willem, this is Michael Willis. I didn't know you were there, but I knew that it was time to talk to you. I was actually calling Henry to tell him that I'm okay and to thank him for talking to Elizabeth. She told me all about it, and what happened to her was amazing. She's so in control now and so clear about what's got to be done, and I just wanted to thank Henry. But while I've got you there, I want to say I'm sorry about the past, Willem." Willem laughed. "That's all right, Michael. I'm pretty sure that's your name, although mine changes a bit. It's not an apology that I was after. All I wanted was to hear your voice and to know that everything's okay," said Willem. Michael was quick to reply, "Everything's okay. That's really what I wanted to say, Willem. Everything's okay." "Thanks, Michael. And from my end, everything's okay as well. It's great to hear about Elizabeth, too. I'll put Henry on," said Willem. Without even saying goodbye and without a word to Henry, Willem handed the phone over to Henry. "Henry speaking," said Henry as he took the phone. "Henry, it's Michael Willis here. I can't thank you enough," said Michael. "What you've done for Elizabeth is remarkable." "That's fine, Michael. Where are you?" said Henry. "I'm in the downtown chambers. I was visiting a couple of people up the road and I got caught when the cyclone hit. So I've just made my way to the chambers. In fact, I was out on Simon Street when a tree blew over. So I huddled against the wall there for a couple of hours until the wind changed directions. Then I moved on. I suppose that was what Elizabeth was feeling. It was a bit of a heavy time, actually. I believe that part of Simon Street has been washed away. It's not there anymore. I guess I moved out at the right time," said Michael. Henry quickly interrupted. "Michael, I want you to get back to that spot and tell me what's happening. I want to know if that wall is breaking. If it's breaking, then we'll have to move people really quickly," said Henry. "Yeah, I can do that. So it's that important, Henry?" asked Michael. "You've got no idea how important it is, Michael," replied Henry. Willem understood exactly what Henry was talking about. Willem had built that wall in the early days to allow the sand to accumulate and that was where the main water flow came through before it was redirected around past the plaza. If that wall let go, they could lose the foundations for at least 60 homes. Michael did not know this and said to Henry, "If it's that serious, Henry, what do I have to look for?" "I'll put Willem back on. He knows all about it," said Henry. Henry put Willem back on the phone, and Willem explained, "Michael, if there's any crack at all in the ground around the top of the park, you'll know that it's all moving, and that will probably happen before the wall lets go. The water flow will tend to go underground and through the sand. So get back to us as soon as you can, Michael, and be careful. You had better take a torch with you just in case, and keep safe. Get back to us as soon as you can, okay?" "Will do, Willem. I'll talk to you later, and once again tell Henry I said thanks." "Bye," said Michael. Michael put down the phone and stood there, taking in a deep breath. He did not want to go back out into that wind, but he knew that he would have to. He was getting a bit old now, and his bones got cold very quickly. He looked around at the only thing there to keep him warm was his much valued judge's robe. He had no option but to put it on under his coat, followed by his hat, and then he tied the belt around himself tightly before heading off into the wind. The rain was so fierce that it stung his face, and did not matter how far down he pulled his hat, it still stung his face. So with his hat pulled down and his head down as far as he could manage, he pushed off toward Simon Street. It took him almost 20 minutes to get there, which amazed him because it was usually only a 5-minute walk, or so he thought. But with his battle against the wind and having to stop regularly to hold himself still to maintain his condition, it took 20 minutes. When he arrived, he saw the exact picture that Willem had described. At the edge of the park, there was a crack wide enough to put your fist through. The park seemed to be sinking, however, only a small amount, but it seemed to have a hollow in it. Michael leaned over with his stick and pushed at the edge of the crack, and it started to fold down into a hole in the ground as if there was nothing underneath it. He quickly pulled back, taking notice of what Willem had said, that if he stood in that area and it was undermined, he would go straight down. He stepped away quickly, turned around, and headed back to the chambers. He was surprised that his trip back was much quicker, as it took less than 10 minutes to return, and he was not at all puffed. The excitement of having to get back to report to Henry had driven him, and he had not even given thought to his ailing legs or his weary body. When he reached the chamber doors, he was amazed at how easily he was able to open them. It was normally a difficult task, but something was happening to him, and it was in the excitement of everything around him that he seemed to be gaining his use. The phone rang, and Henry quickly jumped to his feet. He snapped up the phone and answered. "Yes, Michael." "You must have been waiting for my call," said Michael. "Don't fool around," scolded Henry. "I know how serious this is," said Michael. "You are about to confirm that the park is starting to wash away," said Henry quickly. "That's right," said Michael. "And somehow, Henry, this whole thing has done something to me." Henry smiled and said, "Michael, when I worked with Elizabeth, I also worked with you. Over the next 24 hours, you'll find that the pair of you will recover substantially, and that you'll have a drive within you that allows you to move forward at a rate that you've never moved before. We have much to do, and both you and Elizabeth will be key people in what we have to do in the future." "Henry, you're talking above my head. You'll have to slow down," said Michael. Henry answered, "Michael, there's no time to slow down. What we want you to do is to find the old fire truck and get it over to the edge of the park. We'll meet you there in around 15 minutes. We're going to have to prop that area up." "Fine, consider it done," said Michael. "I'll see you there as soon as I can get there. Talk to you later, Henry." Henry replied, "Bye, Michael, and be extremely careful in every move you make, and make sure there's no panic within anybody. Bye for now." As soon as Henry put down the phone, Willem and Mary began talking at the same time. They almost spoke the same words. Henry, how are you going to fix it? Asked Mary, at the same time as Willem asked, Henry, how are we going to fix this? Henry put his hands in the air like a stop sign and answered, Hey, just hold on a moment. I need a little time to work it out myself. So you don't know either? Asked Willem. Leave him alone, Dad. He'll tell us soon, said Mary. Henry sat and went quiet. The panic of the last few minutes had disappeared from his face, and that beautiful calmness returned. And then suddenly there was a feeling of magic in the room, and they all knew then and there their answer was coming. Henry knew how to contact Simeon in an instant, but he was surprised when Simeon said, Henry, your call, and went silent. Henry sat for a moment longer, and the answer came. He very slowly looked up at Mary and Willem and said, We have quite a task ahead of us. Mary's eyes opened wide and Willem's forehead turned into a frown. Henry's focus went across to Willem, and he said, Willem, we're about to do the job that you told Dad needed doing 15 years ago. Willem's frown deepened. He didn't know what Henry was talking about. Henry continued, You remember the time when you said, if you put foundations in the soft sand, you will have to put false foundations all the way back to the retaining wall. Otherwise, you won't pin the sand under bad conditions and the whole place will move. And Dad had Michael rule against you so that you wouldn't force him to spend the money. Willem remembered all right. He remembered that the information had come to him out of nowhere. He had no qualifications to support it, but at the time he felt so strongly about it that he had gone all the way and had approached Edward Elson directly at his home and passed on the information. It was a massive job, but Edward was not one for spending money that he did not get a return on, so it was never done. Willem thought for a moment and asked, Henry, how can we do that in this weather? If we don't do it in this weather, we'll all end up out at sea because it has already started to undermine and it will lift this whole place into the sea, answered Henry. Willem remembered clearly at that time the picture that had been given to him by Simeon all those years ago. It was the same picture that Henry was describing right now, showing the whole town disappearing into the sea. He knew that Henry was correct, and he looked at Mary and said, Mary, pack some lunches. We've got some work to do. Mary went off to do her chores, and as soon as she left the room, Willem turned to Henry with fear in his eyes and asked, Do you realize to hold all that you'll have to put down at least 100 foundations? How are we going to do that? The fear in Willem was intense. Henry walked over to him and placed a hand on each of Willem's shoulders and tried to reassure him. Calm down, Willem, calm down. I've done this before with the old fire truck and the winch. We can take all of the telegraph poles and drive them into the ground. Then, as we drive those in, we'll move across from one side of the slide to the other, and that will hold while we move further into town and drive them in at critical places. The picture is clear in my mind, and it shouldn't take long. Willem looked at Henry, but his frown deepened. He said, It won't take long. It could take weeks. Henry replied, No, the base is soft enough, so they'll almost fall into the ground, and as each one hits the base, all the sand will consolidate around it. Just wait and see. Well, I'll have to take your word for it. How many people do we need? Asked Willem. We can't use any more than 4 people, said Henry. Any more than that will be too much load. Willem shook his head. Well, there are 2 of us, and there's old Michael. But who else? He asked. It'll have to be Mary, said Henry. Mary can drive the engine, and I can get Andrew on his way to relieve, because I think Michael will need a rest. Willem sucked in a deep breath and sighed. Okay, Henry, you're the boss. How long have we got before we leave? He asked. 5 minutes, answered Henry. All our gear is at the door. We don't need anything else. Well, perhaps a few sandwiches, and we'll get on our way. While you're doing that, I'll call Andrew and get him moving. There are a couple of things I want Andrew to bring along." Willem turned and walked out to tell Mary the news, while Henry picked up the phone and dialed Andrew Kelly. "Kelly speaking," was the reply on the phone. "Andrew, we need your help," said Henry. "Well, that's normal," answered Andrew. "What can I do for you, Henry?" Henry told Andrew the story and said, "Andrew, you're the rope man and we need a lot of rope. We need to lash most of these telegraph poles as they go down so that we can hook them all together. We'll need standard ropes and we'll need some wire rope. We can do it with a lot of people. We can't do it with a lot of people either, so you'll have to get the old truck, fill it up, and get yourself down to the Simon Street Park. Just be careful when you approach it because it's starting to slip away." "Roger," said Andrew. "See you there soon, Henry." Andrew, in his most efficient manner, plonked down the phone and cut it off in Henry's ear once again. He knew that it got to Henry and shook him up each time he did it. He always took great pleasure in hanging up on Henry just to get his response the next time they spoke on the phone. Only this time Henry didn't flinch. Everything was normal for Henry, and he stayed calm and cool. He still maintained the glow that Mary saw in him earlier that day. When Mary came out with her father, all packed, ready to go, she felt her heart go out to Henry. The amazement that she had felt earlier when she looked at him returned. She knew that he was no longer the same Henry who she had struggled with only weeks before. The old Henry who had been so difficult and arrogant had gone. The new Henry was somebody who she absolutely admired. The winds were harsh, and the weather seemed to be getting worse. As they walked along arm in arm, Henry, Mary, and Willem disturbed the elements more than the elements disturbed them. The strength between the three of them was insurmountable, and they walked as if the cyclone did not exist. Just as they were about to round the corner toward Simon Street, they saw the old fire engine with its jerry rig and its drill that they used for everything. It was just pulling up at the edge of the park, and to their surprise, Michael Willis jumped out of the driver's seat like he was a 20-year-old. He had no stick or cane, and he bounced around to the back of the engine and quickly put down the stays. He had somehow known what Henry was talking about, and he already had 2 telegraph poles sitting there ready to go into the ground. By the time the threesome arrived to join Michael, he had already rigged 1 pole and was starting to lift it off the ground. To watch Michael in action was unbelievable. He was a man who normally had trouble getting from his chair to the table, a man who took several minutes to walk from the door of the chambers to his judge's seat, and who creaked and groaned as he sat down. He was now moving around as if there was nothing at all wrong with him. He was throwing equipment around as if it was weightless, and was working in cyclonic winds as if there was no wind at all. Henry greeted Michael with such emotion and such care that even Mary was impressed. There was a communication between Michael and Henry that they had never seen before. It was like a knowing. Michael and Henry began to work together, not even aware that there was anyone else around. Before long, they had their first pole in place, and with a rush, they dropped it into the sand and watched it move down a whole 20 feet in one go. When they brought the rig down on top of it, it easily went in the full distance. Within seconds, you could see the sand start to solidify around the pole. It was like the pole had sucked all of the water out, but in fact, it was the sand moving up against the pole and squeezing the water out. Almost immediately, there was a circle of dryness for about 1 meter around the pole. Michael rushed around and jumped into the driver's seat again and started to back the old engine up. He backed it right up next to the pole that they had just dropped in to the ground. While he was doing that, Henry had rigged the second telegraph pole, and he was pulling that up while Michael moved out of the seat and came around to help him. As they watched, Mary and Willem felt the change within them. They could see the natural communication between Michael and Henry, and they felt it start to happen between themselves. Mary and Willem moved with almost simultaneous motion and headed towards the old truck. Mary jumped into the seat, and neither Henry nor Michael looked around as they finished the second pole. They drove it deep into the ground. The second pole went down a little easier than the first, and for a split second, Henry's concern was that it may disappear. Sure enough, though, when it reached the base, it settled in very quickly and it bridged the sand between the two poles. As the dryness came into the sand once again around the second pole, Michael jumped back and gave Willem a wave, which then relayed the message to Mary. Henry unhitched the rig only moments before Mary drove off, with Willem jumping up on the side to go along for a ride. Mary headed straight for the telegraph pole dumping area, which was not far up the road. While she was moving, Willem gathered his senses and looked around the old fire truck to see how they could get more than two poles along the side of it, because every trip back to the dump would cost them time. By the time they reached the dumping area, Mary knew exactly where to park. Willem had the first pole hitched and ready to pull up within moments of them stopping. As he winched the first pole up, he could see that there was a spot where they could get a second pole on the same side once the first was hooked in. So instead of having to carry one on each side lashed to the running boards, they managed to get two on each side. Within a matter of minutes, they had the truck loaded and were on their way back to where the other poles had been driven into Simon Street. As they arrived, they could see Henry and Michael huddled behind the stone fence, trying to get out of the wind. Before they had turned the truck around, Michael and Henry were already on the controls and were ready to handle the next pole. Willem jumped out of the truck and stood in a position where Mary could see him while he directed Mary back into the most suitable position, which was right alongside the second pole. He also made sure the wheels never came in touch with the soft sand, for even though the surface was still solid, he could see that it was moving as the sand drifted away. Within the next 5 minutes, another 4 poles were planted. This small team operated without any instructions and without the need for any organization. They each knew exactly what to do, and the noise and fury of the winds and the rain made no difference. In a matter of 15 minutes, they had stabilized one of the most destructive areas of the water flow. After observing the complete success of how this worked, they moved on and placed another 4, then 4, another 4, and so on. Just before the final 4 were to go in, a whole section of the wall slipped into the ground and pushed up a huge amount of sand, which then started heading towards the houses. Henry stood back and waited. Fortunately, the truck had moved away from the work area, and they watched all of their work start to move slowly. All of the poles moved, and the sand moved, and they thought they were about to lose the lot. Suddenly, out of the ground came a burst of water just in front of the poles, and the pressure was relieved. The water sprayed a good 50 feet in the air with a rush that would have thrown a person a good 100 yards. Within a moment, everything went quiet, and the work they had prepared had held all of the sand, although part of the wall was missing, and the water was blowing over the top instead of underneath. Henry quickly directed Mary to bring the truck in as close as possible, and he watched the wheels as they almost disappeared in several places. Henry kept her moving, and he got the truck to where the last pole had been inserted. He knew that the 4 poles he had left would get him to the other side, but he had to be quick, and they had to be spread a little further so they could go back and get more poles to support them. Within moments, the first one was inserted into the ground. It went all the way to the bottom without hesitation and then stopped with a mere foot sticking out above the ground. Once again, the sand packed in behind the pole and dried itself immediately. By the time they got the last 4 posts in the ground, the 4 large telegraph poles had disappeared like they were toothpicks in the sand. Everything became steady, and there was no need to rush anymore. They knew that they had beaten the elements, but they knew they still had a day's work behind them and a day's work ahead of them. They felt good enough, and they moved smoothly back and forth from the telegraph pole storage area to the disaster zone. Before long, they had driven in so many poles that there was no chance of any movement for the rest of the town. Henry and Michael understood one another so well that it was uncanny. There was no way that could have happened without intervention, and of course, Mary and Willem, being father and daughter, worked like a team who knew exactly what one another were doing. The two little teams managed to do the impossible over a 6-hour period. When they returned to Mary's house, Michael immediately picked up the phone and called Elizabeth. Even Elizabeth was surprised at Michael's response. Michael had always been a tired man, and he had been very difficult for Elizabeth to work with. He was a husband, a client, an associate, and a judge, but never a friend. When they spoke on the phone, Michael sounded quite different. He was being more than a friend to Elizabeth. He was more than a husband. He was a very special associate. All of the work that Elizabeth had put in over the last 20 years seemed to come to fruition in one phone call. Michael was back again, and his youth and his exuberance shone through, even over the phone. Elizabeth knew that Henry had a lot to do with this, and once she had finished speaking to Michael for 10 minutes, she asked to speak to Henry. Henry picked up the phone, and Elizabeth said, "Thank you so much, Henry. I know what you've done for Michael, and I know what you've done for me, and you've even done it over the phone. I don't know how, and I don't care, but thanks. I'll see you when this is all over." Henry smiled and said quietly to Elizabeth, "That's great, Elizabeth. I look forward to seeing you too." The day had been an eventful one, but not once had they realized that Andrew Kelly had failed to turn up. That was until Henry remembered the phone call. He turned around and asked, "Did anybody see Andrew?" They all looked at one another and said, "No." Henry picked up the phone and rang the plaza immediately. He asked if Andrew had been seen. The voice on the other end of the line said that Andrew had gone out 6 hours ago and he hadn't been in contact since. "Can you get him on the radio?" asked Henry. "No," came the reply from the plaza. "He took the old truck loaded up with everything. He had us all working and loading the truck before he went, but there's no radio in that old truck." The alarm bells went off straight away in Henry's mind. He knew that Andrew was quite capable, but he also knew that Andrew would not set out for a meeting at an arranged destination and then not turn up, not unless there was a major problem. Henry put the phone down and stood for a moment. The concerned look came back to his face, and Mary turned to him and said, "Henry, remember who you are. Remember how you've changed. Don't go back into where you struggle again." In an instant, Henry snapped out of it, and the glow came back to his face. He smiled and said, "Thanks, Mary. I needed that." Henry continued, "I'm not sure what to do about Andrew, though. I'll just sit here with it for a moment and see what happens." "I'll make a cup of tea," said Mary, and she left Henry with his thoughts as she disappeared into the kitchen. Henry sat and contacted that voice again to find out everything he could about what was happening at the moment and what was happening to Andrew. As he settled, a picture came into his mind, a picture of Andrew with his truck bogged up to the axles, sitting on the bonnet with the rain pelting all around him while trying to light a cigarette. As soon as Henry saw the picture, he laughed, and he laughed out loud. Everything came rushing in to see Henry almost splitting. Everybody came rushing in to see Henry almost splitting his sides with laughter. Mary and Michael were standing beside one another, and they both looked into one another's eyes and thought, "Is this man really with it?" Willem went straight up to Henry and held him. He shook him, and Henry put his hands up and said, "It's okay. I just had a vision of Andrew." And he started laughing again. "Well, tell us," demanded Mary, curious as to what could be so funny. Through the middle of Henry's laugh, he explained, Kelly has bogged the truck and he's trying to light a cigarette in the middle of this rain. He burst into laughter again. They all saw the picture, and they all saw the humor of the red-headed Andrew Kelly, the Irishman, steaming while sitting on the bonnet of his truck. He was so angry with himself that he was attempting to light a cigarette just in defiance. He had given up smoking some time ago, but he was going to have one now, in spite of the cyclone. When Henry stopped laughing, he said to the others, "I better go and help Andrew." "I'll come with you," offered Michael. "It's time for you to stop, Michael. You're not as young as you feel," said Willem. "I'm going," insisted Michael as he turned around. "Come on then, let's go," said Henry. They donned their wet weather gear once again and headed out into the wild winds of the cyclone. Henry noticed that he was not affected nearly as much as the first time he walked out. Either the cyclone was easing or he was used to it by now. In any case, he felt reasonably comfortable, and with Michael alongside him, he felt even more comfortable. It was about a 10-minute walk to the spot where Henry had seen Andrew had become stuck. Sure enough, almost in the exact spot that he had seen him, there was the fully laden truck with everything you could think of sitting buried up to its axles in the middle of a normal street. The entire paving had disappeared into the ground and left the belly of the truck sitting right at the edge of the paving. There was no way it could be lifted out without a crane. Andrew had been sitting there for some time. After working extremely hard, using every bit of intuition that he had to try and get the truck out. There were bits of fence, old pipes, everything he could think of that he could gather from anywhere to attempt to lever the truck up, and he had worked all day. He was now so frustrated that he could not even move. When Henry finally did arrive, Andrew did not even look up. He was still steaming until Michael walked up and with a firm voice said, "Andrew, get out of there." Andrew brought himself out of his mood and jumped down off the truck. "I'm so sorry," he said. "I know I've let you all down, and I know that the whole project is ruined because I couldn't get this truck out." "No, we managed to do it. We even forgot you were supposed to be there," said Henry. Andrew's sense of humor soon came back. "You forgot me? You didn't even miss me? And I worked all day trying to get this rotten truck out of the ground, and you didn't even miss me?" he asked. "Sorry, Andrew," said Michael. "We were all engrossed in what we were doing. We hardly even knew each other were there, but we managed to save the town." Andrew was feeling a bit down and asked Henry, "Do you mind if I come along with you?" "This has really worn me out," Henry said. "Fine, let's go back to the house and we'll have a nice cup of tea." During their conversation, the wind had dropped and the sound of the wind had died down. That seemed to happen around Henry, but this time the cyclone seemed to be easing. As they walked back towards the house, the walking was quite easy. Instead of leaning at 45-degree degrees against the wind, it was a mere 30 degrees. Instead of there being gusts that almost blew you over at every step, it was steady. By the time they arrived at the house, Henry turned to Willem and asked, "What do you think, Willem? Do you think it's going?" "It's too steady. I think we're moving into the eye," replied Willem. Willem remembered the time when a cyclone had come through while in Germany and how the eye of the cyclone was totally still. Michael said, "Yes, that's right. If we get the eye of the cyclone through here, it'll go still and then it will change directions and come back and give us the same treatment again from the other direction, which means the other half of the island will be ruined." Henry stood for a while and said nothing. Suddenly he moved on and ushered everybody back into the house. It seemed like he was preoccupied, but he was not telling anybody what was going on inside him. By the time everybody had moved inside, their interest had risen to the point where they were almost bursting, and they wanted to know what Henry was seeing. They wanted to know more about what he was focused on. Henry waved them to one side and ushered them into the kitchen. "Mary, I brought a couple friends for a cup of tea," he said. "Okay, won't be long," said Mary. Henry then disappeared. There was something going on that Henry was not telling anyone. When he disappeared, there was an air of disappointment, and the conversation and the questions started. Everyone wanted to know where Henry had gone, what he was up to. It's okay, he'll let you know shortly, said Mary. It was as if Mary knew exactly what was happening to Henry, but he needed to step aside and listen. Within a few minutes, he came back into the room and asked, "Is the cup of tea ready?" Everyone looked directly at him. His face was glowing again, and he was back to normal. Well, the new normal. The beautiful feelings that came from him enveloped everyone, and their questions disappeared. Mary brought Henry a cup of tea. He looked up and said, "The eye of the cyclone is not coming through here. It's actually just turned and is going back the same way. And as it goes back the same way, we'll be protected by the southern hills. So it's almost over." Willem jumped in very quickly and asked, "How do you know that, Henry?" "It's okay, Willem. I just know," said Henry. "I can assure you that everything's okay. With it turning around the way it is, most of the sand will be put back on the beach, and when the cyclone has gone, it will look like nothing has happened, except for the damage to the houses and the loss of the services." "But how can you know that?" asked Willem. Henry stopped for a moment and said very slowly, "During the cyclone, a lot happened to me. There was a part of me that disappeared. You all noticed that, but there was a part of me that was activated. It allows me to see things and feel things and know things that I never knew before. I can assure you that it is very clear and that I know. It's not what I'm thinking, it's what I know. I can see things that are beyond our normal vision, just like a child can. All I had to do was get away for a moment so that I could look past all of your activities and just simply see what was happening. Sure enough, the cyclone is moving back on itself and we'll be okay." Once again, Henry had caused them all to look at one another and question each other's eyes. He smiled and said, "It's okay. We've all been here before, and we all know what's happening. I think it will take you all a while to get used to it. And as for me, I'm so glad to be here." Mary wrapped her arms around Henry while he sat in the chair, and she said, "Yes, I'm so glad you're here as well." Henry's smile filled the room. Once again, they all felt they were in another land, a land of beauty and mystery that was so familiar to them that they did not want to move. It was not long before Henry's predictions were met, and the winds eased and the rains became vertical instead of horizontal. The problem of additional water flow started to concern Michael. Even though the winds and the cyclone had gone, the rain was falling down in buckets. Michael got up and rang Elizabeth. "Elizabeth, what's happening to the gully through the middle of town?" he asked. With relief, she answered, "You wouldn't believe it, Michael. The water's flowing, but it seems to be lifting the sand and letting it come back to fill the hole. It's like it's running backwards. It's just like the cyclone is pushing everything back to where it came from, and this monstrous big gully, although with this rain you'd think would get bigger, is actually filling in. I don't know where the sand is coming from because the whole place is awash, but it seems to be filling up." Michael smiled when he realized that what Henry had seen was real. He said to Elizabeth, "That's great, my dear. Can you please ring me when you think I could get across and I'll come back home?" Elizabeth's heart lifted. Michael was never concerned about getting back home. Just that small statement indicated to her that everything had turned around in their life. She wanted to continue to talk and not let Michael go, and to her surprise, he felt the same. That was until Mary tapped Michael on the shoulder and said, "Michael, you should free up the phone in case Henry is needed." That caused Michael to straighten up and say to Elizabeth, "I must go now, Elizabeth. It's not good to tap the phone in this state of emergency. I'll talk to you again as soon as it's clear." To Elizabeth's surprise, Michael finished the conversation with, "I love you." Elizabeth burst into tears and replied, "I love you too, Michael. I'll talk to you later," then hung up the phone. As the cyclone dissipated, color started to come back into the landscape, and although it was now late in the afternoon, you could still tell that it was daytime. For the past 24 hours, it had been black, but even though you had visibility when you were outside, inside it had seemed like night. Now, though, it seemed like daytime, and the brightness started to flow back into the people. There seemed to be a lot more activity now as people started venturing outside, even though it was still raining. They were inspecting the damage and looking at the light. The whole feeling of Norwich started to come alive again. Henry stood at the window and gazed out at the sea. The turmoil of the sea was still a highlight. The tide was high, and it was high up on the beach. Many of the buildings that had previously existed in the resort locations on the beach were floating around in the water, all broken and damaged. There were several upturned boats lying in the sand, rather large boats as well. None of that impressed Henry. He simply looked out and saw more than what was in front of him. He saw the beauty of the universe. He watched as the sun went down and felt the calm that existed after the cyclone had cleaned the area. He knew that Norwich was no longer the same town. He knew that his life was no longer the same, and that the lives of many were no longer the same. He also knew that many things had opened to the excitement of the future. Henry's insight was unbelievable, even to him. His ability to look past what was in front of him was so interesting to him. He was totally engrossed in looking around and feeling the difference. As night came, he was happy to continue looking out the window, as were the rest of the people in the household. When the phone rang just before sundown, Henry didn't even bother to pick it up. He pointed to Michael, and Michael picked it up. Elizabeth was on the other end, and she said, I'll be at Mary's house in a few minutes. I'll pick you up. Michael simply said, thank you. He knew that Elizabeth had decided to use the four-wheel drive. Although she had never driven it before, she thought that was Michael's toy. She felt there was no need for it except to drive up to the power station, but she had never been to the power station, and yet now here she was, ready to get into a car that she'd never had any interest in, just to go and pick up Michael. Michael's heart jumped as he realized the love he had for Elizabeth. When he put down the phone, he found everybody grinning and looking at him. He quickly asked, "What are you all looking at?" They all laughed to themselves, but said nothing. Michael sat and waited for his beloved Elizabeth to arrive. The whole household went quiet and waited for the sun to set and for night to arrive. So with that, we'll end this reading of The Magic of Life. And when we return, we'll continue with chapter 35. I wish you a perfect life, perfect health, and a magic future. Thank you.